everyone, welcome back to another video, or welcome if you are new to my channel. Today we're doing another true crime case, as you can tell by the title, and I just want to give a warning about this one because it is quite dark and disturbing. It covers things that happen to children, okay? So if you're sensitive to anything like that, do not watch this video. I even toyed with whether I should even cover this case, but I decided to because it's an unsolved case. It's one of those ones that has been around for quite some time, and it's very intriguing as to what could have happened. And even though we are going to be touching on very sensitive subjects, there's actually no definitive proof that those things happened. Okay, so we're just theorizing about that, but there is mention of it. So without further ado, let's get into the disappearance of Johnny Gosch, which is one of the most famous missing persons cases in the United States, if maybe not the world, because it ended up changing laws on how to deal with missing persons, especially children, and it created the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which was created by Johnny's mum, Noreen. So, Johnny Gosch was born on November 12th, 1969, to Noreen and John Gosch Sr., and he was the youngest of 3 children, but his 2 siblings actually came from Noreen's previous marriage, and they were quite a bit older than him, so they're not really involved in the story too much because I don't think they lived with them when this happened, but they lived in an upper middle class suburb of West Des Moines, Iowa. So before we go into when Johnny's disappearance happened, there's just a couple of things to note beforehand that might help explain the theories later. So, in early August of 1982, Noreen and John Gosch Sr. started receiving anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night at around 1 a.m. John would usually go and pick up the phone, tell them they had a wrong number, and then hang up. And this was almost a nightly occurrence. At the time, there was no such thing as caller ID, so they had no idea who this person was, but they received these calls frequently and just had to tell them time and time again, you've got the wrong number. And on September 3rd, 1982, just a few months before Johnny's 13th birthday, he and his parents went to his brother's football game at the high school stadium. During the game, John Gosch Sr. gave Johnny some money to go and get snacks from the concession stand, and the parents could see the concession stand from where they were sat. So Johnny goes to get some snacks, and after about 5 or 10 minutes, he's not back yet, so they're looking around to see where he is, and they can't see him anywhere. So John gets up to go and look for him, and he finds his son underneath the bleachers, which is what I believe Americans call like the benches where you're sat in a stadium. You can walk underneath them. So he was under there talking to a police officer, and a lot of people point this out as being a little bit strange because why would a police officer be underneath the bleachers where there's no people, it's dark? Like, if you're a cop doing your job and you're on duty, surely you should be out watching where the people are, you know, to see if anything is going down, to stop any trouble from occurring. But that could all just be very innocent, but it's just something to note. So John found Johnny, took it to the cop, and said, come on, let's go sit back down. So he went with his dad and went to sit back down. John never went up to the police officer to like find out who he was or anything, so they don't know who the cop was, and they didn't really ask what they were talking about, it seems like. Then after the game, as they're Johnny spots the officer he was talking to and tells his mum that he wants to be a police officer someday. So as I said, this could have been a very innocent conversation between a boy and a cop, inquiring as to how to become a police officer. It could be something as simple as that. But others wonder if this police officer may have known something about what was going to happen next, and we'll get to that. So the next day after the football game, Johnny's sister came into town, and she was visiting from college with her fiance, so they had like a family day together and a dinner. And Johnny's parents had plans to take him and a friend out to the lake on their boat, and Johnny was really excited about that. Something else to note is that a year before his disappearance, Johnny got a job as a local paper delivery boy, delivering the Des Moines Register to his neighbours. And as most of us know, these paper delivery jobs happen early in the morning, usually before the sun rises. And Johnny really took pride in his job. He was excited to be earning money, and he was wanting to save up specifically for a dirt bike. So he was, really diligent about doing his job. He wanted to get paid. His regular routine was to wake up before dawn and get ready for his paper route, and normally one of his parents would actually go with him, because obviously it's very dark and he's only 12. Well, when he started he may have even been 11 years old, so that's quite young to be going out in the dark on your own. So I think it was normally his dad that would go with him. However, the night before Johnny goes missing, he actually asked his parents if he could do the route alone. His dad, John, said yeah, sure, that's fine with me, but Noreen, his mum, really did not like the idea of Johnny walking around the neighbourhood in the dark by himself, so she said no. So John Sr. told Johnny to wake him up the next day as usual, and he'll go on his paper route with him. That night, Johnny went up to bed, but after a few minutes he came back down and hugged his mum and told her that he loved her, then went back up to bed. Some people find this eerie considering what happens next, and they wonder if maybe he had some sort of intuitive gut feeling about what was going to happen, or they wonder if that conversation with the cop led him to believe that something was going to happen the next day, or that they had plans. But it could also just be a very innocent sort of 12-year-old feeling like, I know mum said I can't go on my own tomorrow, but I'm going to anyway despite what she said, and I'm just going to go and tell her I love her so that she's not too mad at me when she finds out that I went on my own. Could be something like that. And then at 1 AM the phone rang like it had many other nights, and John answered the phone. But this time, instead of just saying you've got the wrong number and hanging up, Noreen said that she heard him say, yeah, okay, alright, and then hung up. She asked him who it was, and he said it was the wrong number. Noreen was slightly confused. She said you don't have a conversation with someone when it's a wrong number, but at the same time she didn't think too much of it because it wasn't a long conversation, and just shrugged it off and went back to sleep. So the next morning, which was Sunday, September 5th, 1982, and this is just a few days after the football game, Johnny did not wake up his dad to go on his paper route with him. He decided to go by himself, but he did take his little Dachshund puppy Gretchen with him. He left home at around 10 to 6 in the morning, and then cut through a neighbour's yard to walk 2 blocks east to pick up his newspapers from the corner of 42nd Street and Ashworth Road. As Johnny approached the corner, he was stopped by a man sitting in a two-tone his house to pick up his newspaper, so Johnny approached him and said, "Can you help this man get to 86th Street?" And he agreed to help the driver with directions. And apparently at this time, Johnny turned to his friend Mike, and they said something along the lines of, "That man is really weird," talking about the driver. And in fact, this driver's behaviour was so strange that John Rossi believed he might have been on drugs. He told the Des Moines Register in 1983 that the guy was high. He said, "When you're drunk, you're drowsy," but he was wide awake and I could see his eyes staring into the horizon. As John Rossi spoke with the driver, Johnny was loading his papers into his wagon and began walking up 42nd Street. When John Rossi finished his conversation with the driver appeared to become agitated and slid back into the driver's seat, where he proceeded to flick his ceiling lights on in the car, on and off 3 times before turning the corner and then speeding off eastbound on Ashworth Road. He then drove 3 blocks before turning onto 39th Street and bolted north. Shortly after this, a 15-year-old carrier, and I'm assuming they mean another delivery boy by that, said he saw a tall man walk out from the shadows between 2 houses and up behind Johnny Gosch as he approached the corner of Marcourt Lane. So we know that there's a driver of a vehicle that's been very odd, and now we know that there's an unknown man that's just walked out of the shadows where Johnny was delivering. When Johnny reached the end of the block, he crossed the street to park his wagon at 42nd and Marcourt, where he usually left it while delivering to Frank Crest Circle. A neighbour watched from his window as a silver Ford Fairmont rolled up and parked at the corner. But due to where his house was situated, he was unable to see Johnny behind the car. So it was unclear whether Johnny was stood on the corner or sitting in his wagon when the car pulled up, or if he'd already started walking down the street. The neighbour said that he turned away for a brief moment and heard a car door slam shut, and when he looked back out the window, he saw that the same car turned left onto 42nd Street and race away, and that's the last time Johnny was seen at approximately 6:06 a.m. But nobody realised anything was wrong until 7:45 a.m. when a neighbour called Johnny's father to ask where his paper was. I actually find that interesting, because if a neighbour said, "I saw him, and then I heard a car door slam, and then I didn't see Johnny after that," why did he not go rushing over to their house and being like, "Johnny's just disappeared"? And they're saying that they didn't figure out anything was wrong until 7:45. I'd never noticed that before, I'm just noticing that now as I'm telling you this. Interesting. Unless maybe the guy just thought, he's gone out of my sight line delivering, maybe that was what it was. So yeah, this neighbour called up John Sr. to ask where his paper was, because he knew that Johnny Gosch was the delivery boy for his newspaper and it never showed up. This obviously immediately struck John Sr. as odd, because Johnny was known for being very responsible and took his job seriously. He'd never skipped one day of work in the 13 months that he'd been delivering the papers. He went into Johnny's room and Johnny wasn't there, so he hadn't even come back home. Now there are 2 different counts of this, but some people say that their dog Gretchen returned home on her own, just walked herself back to the house, and then I think it was in the Netflix documentary, it said that a neighbour found the dog tied to the wagon. But either way, Gretchen the dog ends up back at the house without Johnny. And that really scared his parents, because they just knew that he would not abandon his dog. So John Sr. went out to search the neighbourhood for Johnny and quickly found his abandoned wagon near the corner of 42nd and Marcourt, with the newspapers still inside. Not one of the 37 newspapers had been delivered, so his disappearance happened almost immediately immediately. John then decided to deliver the papers himself before going to search the neighbourhood more thoroughly. Again, lots of people are suspicious of this behaviour, like if your son's gone missing, why are you delivering his papers first? But it could just be purely down to the fact that they were more innocent times back then. I think people maybe weren't as aware of dangers, and so maybe they thought Johnny had just wandered off to go see a friend or something and being irresponsible, you know, turning into a teenager maybe. But after he delivers the papers at around 8:30 a.m, he does call the police and reports his son missing. And this was about 45 minutes after he received the call from his neighbour about where his paper was. And the police didn't exactly hurry to get to them. It took them 45 minutes to get to their house, and the station is only 10 blocks away. When the police did get there, they immediately said that he must have run away or just be out somewhere. Maybe he went to a friend's house or something without telling anybody. And he asked Noreen, has he ever run away before? Obviously using the word before there means that he's implying that this is definitely what happened, which must be frustrating for a policeman to immediately assume that he's run away. So Noreen had already gone and talked to all the paper boys and any neighbours that may have had any information or seen Johnny that morning. She put together all the witness statements for the police when they were there, and she told them that she believed that her son had been kidnapped or abducted. But the police didn't go and interview people on their own because they just believed straight away that Johnny was a runaway. They said that there was no crime scene, nobody saw anything, and he just vanished, and to them, the explanation for his disappearance has to be a runaway. One of the neighbours said, Johnny was our paper boy, I knew him, I knew his parents, we'd been out to dinner with him, Johnny would not run away. And at this point, the police told John and Noreen that they could not classify their 12-year-old son missing until he was gone for 72 hours. This is absolutely wild to me, that this law, or I don't know if it was a law or just code of conduct, ever existed. 72 hours, 3 days, is an insane amount of time to wait to start looking for a missing person. Like, time is of the essence. When someone goes missing, you need to get on that straight away. And understandably, Johnny's parents were horrified and shocked by this as well. They argued that it was unlike Johnny to disappear without telling anyone, and they were absolutely certain that something had happened to him. They explained how he left his newspapers in his wagon just sitting outside, and that he was normally very responsible, who wanted this job so that he could save up money, and he always delivered his papers on time. But none of that mattered to the police. They were convinced that Johnny was a runaway, and that was that. They reasoned that since his wagon was left undisturbed, there were no papers missing and nothing had toppled over, that there were no obvious signs of foul play. They said that the boy must have decided to run away and that he would return on his own. So before I go any further into the case, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Noreen, Johnny's mum, because she is a major player in this whole case. Ever since Johnny's been missing, she has worked tirelessly and relentlessly to keep this case alive. She really took it upon herself to try and figure out what happened to him because, as you'll learn, the police were not very cooperative. And because of this, I think she rubbed police officers up the wrong way. I think they considered her to be a bit bullish and brash and just didn't like that she was so pushy. But I mean, she's got a missing child, of course she's going to be that way, what else do you expect? But I think for for some reason they just did not like that about her. But just to show what her personality is really like, it's important to know some of the things that she's been through prior to this. Noreen was born and raised in eastern Iowa, and she first got married in her 20s to her first husband, who I can't really find any details about online. I don't know his name, but they had their first 2 children together, and at some point he developed cancer. And just 2 months before he passed away, their house got hit by a tornado. And I mean, it completely decimated their home. It was flat, there was nothing left of it. And this happened while they were inside. So, you know, at this point she's dealing with essentially her husband's end-of-life care. And now their house has been flattened by a tornado. Once the tornado subsided, Noreen said she was trying to look for her 2 children in the debris because, as I said, it was completely flattened and everything was everywhere. So she was picking up, you know, rafters and probably bits of drywall, trying to look for her kids. And then it started to pour with rain, like torrential rain, a really big storm. And this is actually what ends up helping her find the kids, because they start screaming because the rain is so heavy, and she finds them face down in the gravel, surrounded by broken glass. And then only a few weeks after all of this, with the tornado and having to, I imagine, getting rehomed or finding a new home. I don't live in America. What happens if your home is flattened by a tornado? Do you get housed in a hotel? Like, what happens? Please let me know. I'm so interested to know what happens. So only a few weeks after this, her husband passes away from cancer and she has to start over all by herself with 2 children. And Noreen said that this was a moment in her life that made her realise she can either break down in despair and just let depression take hold of her and curl up in a ball and not really carry on, or she can get up, be strong, and just keep on moving. And that's exactly what she did. She just kept on moving, which is very admirable, you know, because some people might not have the mental capacity to be able to do that, but she did. She was a strong woman. She was just like, I'm not gonna let these tragedies defeat me. Then a couple of years later, that's when she met John Gosch Sr. and they got married and had Johnny. So I just share this to say that she's obviously dealt with a fair amount of tragedy in her life, and the fact that she's able to just keep going just shows how strong-willed she is. And because of this, like I said, I think a lot of authorities and maybe even neighbours and members of the public felt that she was somewhat too assertive or too pushy in her pursuit of Johnny's case. They didn't really like that she was trying to conduct her own investigation and just wouldn't be told what to do. Essentially, she didn't fall in line. So, after the initial meeting with the police the morning of Johnny's disappearance, they don't return until 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and this was when an officer and a detective interviewed John and Noreen. But it seems like the detective didn't believe their answers at all. Noreen tried to give them pictures of Johnny, but the police wouldn't even take them. So bizarre, like why? And it's all because they believed he was a runaway. They didn't want to investigate Johnny's disappearance as a crime yet. They canvassed the neighbourhood, asking neighbours if they had seen Johnny that morning, and they searched the woods near the house. But again, they're looking for a kid hiding, not for a kid that's been abducted. When the word spread that Johnny Gosch was missing, people in the community came together to form a search party. About 20 volunteers organised a search from their local park. And then Police Chief Cooney arrived on the scene, and apparently this guy was known to be a bit of an alcoholic, and eventually he would leave the force in disgrace, but at this point in time he's the man in charge. And when he went to they said that they would come in a few days if the local police still hadn't found Johnny. So 3 days after Johnny's disappearance, 2 FBI agents came to Noreen and John's house and told them that Chief Cooney had said that he didn't need their help. They said that they couldn't get involved in the case at this point because it was still under local jurisdiction. The sheriff of Dallas County, which is the next county over, told Noreen that he had sent officers to help, and several other local county sheriffs did the same, but Chief Cooney refused the help. What's wrong with this guy? Is he a big egomaniac that he doesn't want to take on other people's help? Like, what is going on? At one point, Noreen wanted to use the National Guard helicopters to help search for Johnny, but she and John were told by the governor of Iowa, Robert Ray, that they would have to pay $800 an hour to use it, and they did not have that kind of money. So it just goes to show that Noreen is trying to do everything she possibly can, or both her and John, I suppose, everything they can to try and find Johnny. One positive thing about this case is that it got a lot of media coverage. Noreen was out there trying to get help from all the law enforcement agencies and different government entities, and since they weren't really helping her, the local news picked up the story and started doing interviews. And at one point, a TV station in Omaha actually had picked up on the news that the governor had refused to allow their helicopters to be used, so they sent their own news helicopters to help search for Johnny, which is such a great thing. It's nice to know that at least there were some kind people around trying to help. Eventually, Noreen also learned that the police could have used canine search teams for free, but Chief Cooney didn't allow it. So odd. So it really does seem like the local police are just being very stubborn about what they think happened and how much help they were willing to give and receive, which is just crazy behaviour for a missing child. And all of this makes people wonder if members of the local police had anything to do with Johnny's disappearance, or if they were just somehow involved, which you can't really blame people for coming to that conclusion when they're just being so uncooperative about a missing child. Noreen quickly learned that she needed to write everything down about the investigation that she could, because it didn't seem like anyone else was doing it. She asked officials if she could quote them and tracked everything by specific dates and times. She also wrote down any tips that came in from the media, and she presented it all to the police. When she asked Chief Cooney about the tips that she'd brought to him, he always told her that it wasn't relevant, or he didn't think it was worth following up on. Just absolutely mad. So for a long time, Johnny was listed as a runaway in the police system. It took Noreen 4 months to get his case reclassified as a kidnapping. So the police did eventually admit that Johnny could have been kidnapped, but they couldn't pinpoint a motive and barely had any evidence, which made things really difficult. So with no evidence, no motive, and no suspects, the case quickly went cold. But I find it odd that they say there's no evidence or suspects, because we clearly have eyewitnesses of the driver that was asking for directions from both neighbours and the paper boys. They know the 2 Ford Fairmont cars were in the area at the time. They know what colour they were, and apparently one of them had a Nebraska license plate. refused. So by this point, Noreen knew in her heart that Johnny had been kidnapped. She was sure of it. And she started to suspect that possibly Chief Cooney could be somehow involved, because there was no other explanation for why he was constantly refusing to investigate leads and treat her son's case as an abduction. Eventually, Cooney did end up getting removed from his position, but we still don't know if he was ever involved or not. So now, Noreen decides to take matters into her own hands and called a press conference where she spoke about Johnny's case and the potential connection with the case about the young girls that she found in the newspaper. She also just wanted to warn parents and the public about what could have potentially happened to prevent it happening again. She also said in this press conference how the police were not investigating the case properly, and she said that they were pretty much incompetent. They were not doing their jobs properly. And once Chief Cooney saw this, he went to her house and confronted her. He was furious and screaming at her. Weirdly, after this press conference, Noreen started receiving death threats. And someone called her apparently and said, "If you don't stop making waves, you're dead." So, why is she getting this kind of backlash? Who are these people threatening her? Could any of them be involved? I mean, I know it's the early 80s, but surely there's such a thing as tracking phone calls. No, I mean, maybe not, I don't know, but if there was, they should have done that. After a while, the police told Noreen and John that they were no longer prioritising their son's case because there were no leads. I mean, not that they were really prioritising it at all, it doesn't seem like it anyway. And apparently, this is terrible. An investigator visited Noreen at her workplace and told her that she should just have another baby to keep herself busy and forget all about Johnny. I cannot believe that. That's insane. And luckily, Noreen's boss actually overheard this comment, stepped in and demanded that the investigator leave. Thank God she had someone there to witness that, because the way she's being treated, maybe no one would have believed her otherwise. So at this point, the Gosch family wasn't getting any help from the police department at all, because they just decided there was nothing they could do. And the FBI also weren't really wanting to cooperate with Noreen. People were starting to think that Noreen was a bit crazy. She said during an interview that, I don't know if it was the local police or the FBI, referred to her as a loon. So, the FBI also said that the police department wasn't letting them help, so they couldn't do anything. After being told that the case is no longer a priority, Noreen and John hired their own high-level private investigators, and these were Jim Rothstein, a retired detective from the NYPD, and Ted Gunderson, a retired FBI chief from LA. They also had to hire their own sketch artist to create a composite sketch of the male suspects that were seen talking to Johnny that morning, which, again, why did the police not have their own sketches drawn up? It just seems like the police were so unwilling to use any of their resources, and it makes you wonder why. In December of 1982, another private investigator named Dennis Whelan travelled to Houston, Texas, where he claimed that he witnessed a child auction. He hoped that Johnny would be among those children being sold, and Johnny wasn't there. In 1982, Noreen and John Gosch established the Johnny Gosch Foundation, and their mission was to educate children and adults about the common tactics and motives of kidnappers and child predators. And Noreen used the foundation to become a vocal advocate. She helped other families and worked on other cases. She really made this her life's work, her life's mission. In 1984, Johnny became one of the first missing children featured on a milk carton to raise awareness, but that isn't done today. I don't think anymore, but it was at the time, and I think it was quite a successful thing. In 1984, the Johnny Gosch bill became law in Iowa, and Noreen had worked very hard to get it passed. And this law mandated immediate police response in missing children's cases, so it eliminated that 72-hour waiting period, thank God. And multiple states adopted similar laws. Noreen testified before the US Senate about organised, I don't know if I can say this word, begins with P, ends in philia. I think you know what I mean. Because she believed that this is what led to her son's kidnapping, organised crime of this nature. She stated that if the FBI was not going to investigate missing children's cases, funding should be reallocated to an agency that would. And her testimony was controversial because she named everyone that she felt failed Johnny's case and spoke directly against the FBI. But after her testimony to the US Department of Justice, they allocated $10 million to establish the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, so that was a major accomplishment on Noreen's part. Good for her. But during all this time, there were still reports of potential sightings of Johnny. On March 2nd, 1983, a woman reported seeing Johnny in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She said she saw him running away from two men and screaming for help. She said that he ran up to her begging for help and said, "Please lady, help me, my name is John David Gosch." The men caught up to him, and one man grabbed Johnny by the arm and twisted it painfully behind his back, dragging him away. The woman reported the incident to police, but the police dismissed it as a family situation. They believed it was a kid pretending to be Johnny Gosch. That's wild that they wouldn't even look into that. And this woman never forgot about this boy. She believed he was truly in trouble. In October, she saw a TV show about another child abduction that referenced Johnny, and his picture was shown, and she realised that it was that same boy that came up to her. So she went back to the police and insisted that it was Johnny. And this time, they notified Johnny's parents, and private investigators got involved that worked closely with the FBI. By January of 1984, it was confirmed that the boy was Johnny Gosch. That's gotta be infuriating for his parents that it was him, but they never investigated that. So, what can they do now? Mental. Noreen and John needed help financing their search efforts, which obviously includes things like paying for investigators, flyers, all these kinds of things. So they began selling candy bars with John's picture on the wrapper, and by early 1984 they'd sold nearly 18,000 candy bars, and that helped fund their efforts. In January of 1984, a private investigator named Sam Soder contacted Noreen. He said he wanted to help with their case, so they met at his office. Noreen went alone and brought a tape recorder with her. Sam Soder said that an informant predicted a future abduction. He said a young boy would be kidnapped from the south side of Des Moines, and that it would occur in the second week of August. Noreen was shocked that Sam had not gone to the police with this, so she was skeptical and took the tape to investigators, but they dismissed her. Shocker. Every time Noreen brought information to law enforcement, it was just dismissed. I don't understand. She also brought the tape to the media, but no one would listen. But Frank Santiago from the Des Moines Register finally did agree to listen. And as predicted, in 1984, another paperboy disappeared, and his name was Eugene Martin, and he was only 13 years old. He, just like Johnny, had an early morning paper route. On August 12th, Eugene was delivering papers on the south side of Des Moines. 3 witnesses say they saw him talking to a man, which they assumed was his father based on body language. But then Eugene vanished, and his stack of newspapers was found on the sidewalk, just like Johnny's. Police began searching immediately, and the FBI was called right away, so maybe the police had kind of learned from Johnny's case. Days later, a tip said Eugene was seen in Ankeny, Iowa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Police used a spotlight helicopter for 2 hours overnight, but the search was called off before sunrise. Community volunteers were called in, and searches were organised in Warren County woods and around Easter Lake. A $64,000 reward was offered for information leading to Eugene Martin and Johnny Gosch. Sue Martin, Eugene's mother, said that Eugene would only follow a stranger if he was politely asked for directions, which is exactly what happened with Johnny. Her and Donald Martin, his dad, waited by the phone for months, but a call never came. They had planned Eugene's 14th birthday and made him a birthday cake, which they froze, and kept a new bicycle for his paper route just in case he ever was found or came home. But unfortunately, Eugene was never found, and Eugene's parents also criticised police tactics. They said that the police knew how to handle robberies and fights, but they did not know how to handle missing children's cases, and they believed that crucial information was just being ignored. After Eugene's kidnapping, Noreen received a strange poster, and others in the community received it as well. The poster showed a sketch of the man seen with Johnny near the blue Ford Fairmont, and a second sketch that looked exactly like Sam Soda, the man that came to her saying this second abduction was going to happen. It looked just like him. And it turns out that he has a bit of a sketchy past. He had information about child rings, if you know what I'm trying to say, but without saying it there, in Omaha. And he was a spokesperson for an anti-child pornography group. Again, I don't know if I can say those kinds of words, so I'm trying my best to, say what I need to say without really saying it. He knew about someone called Frank Sikora, who had apparently molested at least 14 paperboys, and he was fired after these allegations. Sam said that Frank abducted Johnny and Eugene. He said that Frank knew all the routes and carriers of the paperboys. At this time, Noreen is still receiving threats and prank calls. Apparently, one caller warned her to drop the case, and 20 minutes later, a man could be seen throwing rocks at their front window. Another caller demanded a $10,000 ransom for Johnny's return. Noreen followed instructions that they needed to receive the money by 1 a.m, but the police failed to organise all of this in time, so they didn't get the money by 1 a.m. And then the caller called back and said, "You waited too long, lady, you won't get your kid back." But Noreen does think that this call was fake. She thinks it was just someone trying their luck to try and get money out of her, which it could very well have been. In July of 1985, a woman in Sioux City received a dollar bill with writing on it that said, "I am alive, Johnny Gosch." She took this bill to authorities, and handwriting analysis confirmed that the signature matched Johnny's. The bill was dated to 1970, so 4 years before the abduction, so Johnny was definitely alive when he wrote it, but there was no way to know if he was still alive. In March of 1986, 13-year-old Mark Allen also disappeared in Des Moines. The day before Easter, Mark was walking to a friend's house, and his mother was ordering pizza, so just before he left the house, he turned to his mum and said, "Save me some pizza, Mum. I'll be hungry when I get back," and waved goodbye. But he never made it to his friend's house, and no witnesses saw any suspicious activity. And police refused to declare him missing for 48 hours. They also denied there was any connection between Johnny, Eugene and Mark going missing. On Valentine's Day of 1988, Noreen received a typed letter postmarked as being from Idaho that claimed to be from Johnny. The letter said that he could never come home, that his appearance had now been changed, and to please never forget him. And it was signed, "Love your son, Johnny Gosch." And Noreen says that she knows that it's him because of how he signed the letter off. Apparently he had this thing about whether he wrote letters or like Christmas cards and birthday cards, he'd always say, "Love your son, Johnny Gosch." And they'd kind of playfully tease him about it, saying you don't need to write your full name, but he always did. So now we're going to talk about a man named Paul Bonacci. I've seen people pronounce it either Bonacci or Bonacci. I'm going to say Bonacci because it just kind of sounds like that's how I should say it. I'm sorry if it's wrong, but that's what I'm going to say. Because Paul Bonacci is a huge part of this case and what potentially happened. So he came into the Johnny Gosch case in 1989 because he came forward and revealed some chilling details involving a human trafficking cartel. And he said that this cartel was allegedly led by a prominent businessman named Lawrence E. King Jr. Now, Lawrence King Jr. had been the director of the Franklin County Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska, and he was also a rising star in the Republican Party, and he was also known for opera singing. At the time Paul came forward, he was about 21 years old, and he had previously spoken to a psychiatrist about an incident involving an Iowa paperboy. Paul's lawyer, John DeCamp, read the transcript from this psychiatric session and was stunned by what he had read and began researching the Johnny Gosch case. He discovered that the dates mentioned in Paul's transcript matched reports from Johnny's disappearance. So he contacted John and Noreen Gosch. John Gosch Sr. received the phone call from him, but chose not to tell Noreen about it at the time. Instead, he went to visit Paul Bonacci in prison on his own. Now, Paul Bonacci, I must say, was already in prison on, I think, molestation charges against young boys. But I'm going to get into that a bit more, so bear with me. But during this prison visit, Paul looked at John Gosch Sr. and said, "You look like... It can't be the eyes, you look like Johnny Gosch." So John Gosch was obviously taken aback by this, but after his meeting with him, he believed Paul Bonacci, but he just wanted to try and verify some of his claims. So he hired a private investigator named Roy Stevens, and he spent hours interviewing Paul Bonacci, and they were recorded on tape. During these interviews, Paul stated that a man he referred to as Emilio ran a kidnapping business and he sold children. Paul said Emilio explicitly targeted children from close, loving families. Apparently he did this to inflict the most emotional pain possible because he said Emilio liked to hurt people. Paul stated that Emilio kidnapped him when he was a teenager and brought him to Des Moines, Iowa, where they stayed overnight in a hotel. Paul said that while they were staying the night in this hotel, a man came to their room and brought with him a photograph of a young boy. Paul was told that the boy in the photograph was the child they were going to kidnap. When they woke up early the next morning, and we're talking very early, the same kind of time as paperboys would get up, they put Paul in the back seat, and Emilio apparently drove a blue Ford Fairmont, where he drove to Johnny Gosch's neighborhood. Paul stated that Emilio pulled Johnny into the car, and Paul was instructed to hold him down and keep him quiet. After the abduction, Emilio forced Paul at gunpoint to molest Johnny. Johnny, and apparently Emilio recorded this all on tape. So that is why Paul Bonacci is in prison, because somehow he must have got released from this situation and someone had gone to the police about him molesting them. The private investigator found 2 people who indicated that Paul Bonacci was involved in Johnny's kidnapping. Despite this, Paul's lawyer John DeCamp believed Paul was telling the truth, and the FBI did not investigate Paul's claims. Neither did the local police. As Paul Bonacci was coming forward, other victims began coming forward as well, and one of those was 21-year-old Alicia Owen, and she corroborated Paul Bonacci's story, claiming that Lawrence King Jr. was throwing these illicit parties involving children, and that they were offered to guests at these parties. They described being given drugs and alcohol and being auctioned off, and multiple people came forward with a very similar story. By 1990, the case against Lawrence King was brought before a Douglas County, Omaha grand jury, where they concluded that Paul Bonacci's story was a carefully crafted hoax. It was revealed that Paul had multiple personality disorder, which is now known as dissociative identity disorder. And because of this diagnosis, it caused many people to believe that Paul was not credible. Paul apparently recalled events involving Johnny during interviews by accessing or switching between personalities, and that's how he was able to give information. Now, what I will say is that DID is usually caused by extreme trauma. That's how something like this usually occurs. So the fact that he has this, in my mind, doesn't necessarily make him not credible. If anything, it shows that he's been through some serious stuff. I don't know, I'm not saying that he's telling the truth, but at the same time, I don't think it immediately means that he's not credible just because he has DID. That's usually the result of extreme trauma. Multiple personalities are created usually to help someone cope with a very harsh reality. And if what Paul's saying is right, then he's been through extreme trauma, being forced to do things that he didn't want to do at a very young age. But despite multiple victims coming forward, Paul Bonacci was indicted on perjury charges, and so was Alicia Owen, but Paul's charges were dropped because Paul was already serving time for abuse. However, Alicia was found guilty and was sentenced to 9 to 15 years in prison, and she was sentenced specifically for coming forward in the Lawrence King case. Lawrence King was never charged with trafficking. However, he and several officers of the Franklin County Credit Union were indicted for embezzlement and fraud, because apparently he had embezzled nearly $40 million, and he served 15 years in prison for financial crimes, but he was never convicted on trafficking charges. Paul Bonacci attempted to file a civil lawsuit against Lawrence King, but Lawrence King did not respond to this lawsuit, and on February 27th of 1999, Paul Bonacci was awarded $1 million in damages from Lawrence King, but apparently that never got paid. Noreen still didn't know anything about Paul Bonacci until March of 1991, when Roy Stevens contacted her, and he showed her the taped interviews with Paul Bonacci. Noreen was shocked because she could see her husband sitting in the chair in these tapes, and knowing all this information and not telling her, but also apparently in the tapes he looks kind of bored and apparently even falls asleep at one point. So Noreen was just really shocked that her husband had kept all this from her. He says he did it to protect her because he wanted to find out if anything was true before telling her about this. But eventually they did get divorced. They appeared to be on very different pages when it came to what happened he was telling the truth. Paul was shown photographs of approximately 12 men and was asked if he could recognise anyone involved in Johnny's kidnapping or this ring that he spoke of. And one photograph was of a man that Noreen and John had already suspected, and Paul identified that man. He said that this was the man that came to the hotel the night before Johnny was kidnapped, and showed him that photograph of Johnny, and he identified him as Sam Soda, that private investigator that predicted this abduction of Eugene. So a few months later, in October 1991, Paul told John and Noreen the whole story. Upon meeting Noreen for the first time, Paul became extremely emotional. You could tell he was just completely overtaken with emotion and specifically feelings of guilt. But he told John and Noreen that another man had come to the hotel that night before Johnny was abducted, and his name was Tony. The men looked at several pictures of young paper boys and decided that Johnny would be likely to bring in the most money. Paul said that whilst in the backseat of the Ford Fairmont, he held Johnny down and used chloroform to knock him out. Johnny was then transferred to another vehicle, a van, and the other drivers were Tony and Sam Soda. Whilst Johnny was unconscious, they all stopped for a drink before driving to Sioux City. And in Sioux City, Johnny was locked in a windowless room in a farmhouse and was kept there for about a week or so. And after that, Johnny was taken to Colorado. Noreen and John believed Paul because they think that he knew things about Johnny that had never been publicised before. For example, that Johnny had a stutter when he was nervous. He also described things like a scar on Johnny's tongue and a scar on his lower leg from a burn, which none of this information was released to the public, so how would he know these things if he'd never physically seen Johnny? Paul also knew about the birthmark on Johnny's chest, but that detail had been disclosed publicly, so that's kind of like, he could have read about that. Paul also knew that Noreen was a yoga instructor and that she would take Johnny to work with her. Which again, how would he know this? I mean, unless maybe she has a website or something. That could be the case. He also knew that a neighbour in their neighbourhood had seen someone take Johnny's picture one day when he was walking home from school. And this neighbour came forward after the kidnapping had taken place, but this had never been released to the public, but again, Paul knew about it. Investigators also verified Paul's claim that multiple vehicles were involved in Johnny's abduction, one vehicle being blue and the other black and white. But again, the FBI and the West Des Moines Police Department refused to speak with Paul. They also refused to follow up on any tips he provided. At first, investigators couldn't believe that Johnny had been taken to Colorado, as Paul had said, but in 1991, a message was discovered on a bathroom wall at a Denver restaurant written in red nail polish, saying, "Johnny Gosch was here." Paul had been with Johnny and another boy that day that the message was written, and he was able to describe the restaurant. He explained that they were painting their nails in the bathroom when Johnny wrote the message. In 1992, America's Most Wanted featured an episode about Johnny Gosch. John Walsh from America's Most Wanted had Paul take them to the house in Colorado where they were held. And when they got to this house, Paul appeared emotionally triggered and very agitated at being back at this place. He knew exactly where the entrance to the dugout area under the house was, and it was literally like an unfinished basement, like a muddy basement with some wooden rafters and things. They even found initials carved into the wooden beams down there of possibly these children's initials. And Paul said that this is where the children were kept, especially if anyone visited the house. But even after all of this, the police still didn't follow up on any of it. Whilst Paul was in prison, he received the illegal ring, and these letters reference someone named J.G., which could be Johnny Gosch. In a letter from the third boy who had been at the restaurant in Denver, he said, "I remember the restaurant in Colorado. We painted our nails and I wrote on the wall with J.G." Other letters talked about Emilio. These letters referenced other kidnapped boys such as Mark Allen and Eugene Martin, and they mentioned someone called the Colonel, and the Colonel was allegedly a code name for someone named Michael Aquino, who was apparently a political scientist and a military officer. And, okay, this is where, I mean, everything's already crazy, but just to add another level of crazy, apparently this Michael Aquino was an ordained satanic priest in Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. And in 1975, Aquino separated from the Church of Satan and formed his own organization called the Temple of Set. I know, it's also confusing, and things start becoming almost unbelievable, right? That's why it's so hard to know what really happened. And at this point, the Gosch family had become quite controversial. People were making threats against them still, but they'd started saying slanderous things about them. And because of this, they were involved in many court cases over the years for different reasons. It seemed like they were in a constant fight with the public as well now. At one point, Noreen was testifying in court about something. I'm not entirely sure what this was, but while she was under oath, she was asked if she'd ever seen Johnny since his disappearance. And this is when she decided to come forward and say that yes, she had seen him, that she'd actually met with him, which was shocking to everyone. Like, what are you talking about? You've seen your son since he disappeared and you didn't tell anybody? You know, it just kind of throws another spanner in the works as to this whole thing being unbelievable. But Noreen said that in March of 1997, her son came to visit her in the middle of the night. She said it was early in the morning and she got a knock on her apartment door, and he was with another young man. Here is her direct quote from Noreen about this. She said, "There was a knock on my door, a persistent knocking. I went to the door and I could see a young man standing out there, and I kept looking at his eyes, and the eyes don't change. And so I said, 'Who is it?' And he said, 'It's me, Mum, Johnny.'" She said that Johnny's hair was straight and dyed jet black, and it came all the way down to his shoulders, and he was wearing a coat over a t-shirt and jeans, and that he was 27 at the time. She said she talked to him for about an hour, and Johnny told her that he'd seen her on a talk show and that she'd said for him to contact her somehow and that she hoped he would. Noreen had done many talk shows over the years. She took every media opportunity that she could. She said that she recognised Johnny immediately by his eyes and confirmed his identity by showing the birthmark on his chest to her. But she didn't find out much about Johnny's adult life, but he confirmed the kidnapping and everything that Paul Bernardi had been saying. He told her that he had been abducted into an underground P-file ring and trafficking organisation. He said that once he was too old to be useful, he was thrown into the streets with nowhere to go and living in constant fear that they would return to kill him. Because he was a witness to all this, so he was forced to live under a fake identity. He claimed that it was too dangerous to come home. He feared for not only his own life, but also the lives of his loved ones. And, you know, Noreen could have lied about this. She didn't have to come forward. She'd kept it to herself for quite some time at this point, so she didn't actually have to tell anyone this and face further doubts from people, but she decided to tell the truth. because you're putting him into more danger, you would have kept it a secret as well. Which is fair enough. Now, a thought that I had about this situation with Johnny visiting her is that maybe by this point, it's been over 10 years. And even though Noreen is very strong and, fighting the good fight, I think there is such a thing as hope being able to delude you a little bit. I think you can become a little bit naive to certain things. So, this person turning up at her house might not have been Johnny. It might have just been some random oddball that decided to pretend he was Johnny for whatever reason. There are people that confess to murders they've never done before. There are strange people in the world. So I wouldn't rule out that could very well be what happened here. And because Noreen is in such a state of hope and wanting to know that her son is okay, she could have fallen for it. I think that's a possibility here. But anyway, that's just my thought. Paul Bonacci also talked about how prominent people were involved in this trafficking ring. He said that they were people in positions of power in business, in government, and maybe even in law enforcement. And that they will do whatever they need to do to eliminate anyone who might expose them. Now, considering what we're all learning about, like these Epstein files recently, that would not shock me whatsoever if prominent people were involved in a ring in Iowa. That would not shock me at this point, and I don't think it would shock any of us, would it? And that's kind of why I wanted to cover this case. I'm not saying this is connected to Epstein in any way, but the fact that we know these things do happen kind of makes you look at this with fresh eyes. Like, maybe there was a link somehow, or, again, with this Lawrence King guy being a prominent person, he very well could have been involved. And obviously these people don't want their victims returning to their families afterwards and potentially spilling the details about what they've been through or going to the police. So if all of this is true, that this is what happened to Johnny, and Noreen believes that it is, and she believes that Johnny visited her, it would have been dangerous for her to talk, because, if these people are powerful and prominent, they probably could hire a hitman or something, take her out, if she was to say too much. But what's interesting is that John Gosch Sr., Johnny's father, he said publicly that he wasn't sure that he believed his ex-wife's story about this. So they were on two different pages about this. Noreen eventually published a book in the year 2000 called Why Johnny Can't Come Home, and it's essentially an expose into the world of child trafficking and pornography. I'm not going to say the whole word just in case, but it exposes how dangerous it is and the kinds of people that could be involved in something like this. On September 1st, 2006, Noreen had another secret visitor. This time, someone left a stack of photographs at her door, and one of these photos showed a man who looked like he could be dead, and there was something around his throat. And other photos showed young boys tied up and gagged. These were extremely disturbing photos, but one of them really grabbed Noreen's attention. It showed a boy tied up and gagged that looked to be about 12 years old, and that he possibly was branded on his shoulder. And Noreen believes that this boy is Johnny, and it felt like someone was sending her a message. She later figured out that some of these photos came from a child website, if you know what I'm trying to say there, that were printed off. Disgusting. On September 13th, 2006, the Des Moines Police Department received an anonymous letter that read, "Gentlemen, someone has played a reprehensible joke on a grieving mother. claimed that the photo was not of Johnny. It said that the photo showed 3 boys in Tampa, Florida from 1979 to 1980, that apparently these boys were challenging each other to an escape contest. There had been an investigation by the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office and no charges were filed, no wrongdoing was established, and the lead detective was Nelson Salva. He had investigated 2 of the photos in the late 1970s, years before Johnny was kidnapped, and the boys in the photos said that they had posed willingly, there was no coercion, there was no touching. However, Nelson could not verify that the photos Noreen received were the same ones he investigated. Noreen claimed that Nelson didn't even look at them before dismissing a connection. 3 of the boys in the photos were identified, but the 4th boy was not, and that is the one that Noreen believes could be Johnny. Again, John Gosch Sr. did not think that this was Johnny. I find this very hard, because how can 2 parents look at the same picture and one of them think it's their son and one of them not? It's just so confusing. But some people are very suspicious of John Gosch Sr. and they think that maybe he had something to do with Johnny's disappearance. Years later, Noreen learned from Jim Rothstein, the retired NYPD detective, that the Des Moines Police Department had been ordered to stand down the morning that Johnny disappeared, so that's why they didn't turn up again until 2 p.m. That's why the helicopters weren't used, why they stopped the search party, why the canine searches didn't happen. And some theorise that John Gosch Sr. was involved in this whole situation. They think that it's suspicious that he took that phone call in the middle of the night before Johnny disappeared, where he seemed to have a very short conversation. It's also suspicious that Johnny went alone on his paper route, even though Noreen said no. And one thing I did think about this is, like, John Sr. told Johnny to wake him up in the morning to go with him on his paper route, and Johnny didn't. But surely, as a parent, if you were doing this anyway, you would have an alarm set ready to go. You don't rely on your child to wake you up, right? It's usually the other way around. Usually the parent gets up and gets the child up. So yeah, that's a little bit odd. In a 1999 court case, a judge asked Paul Bernacchi how the kidnappers knew that Johnny would be alone. Paul answered without hesitation, saying that prior arrangements had been made with John Gosch Sr. during a 1:30 a.m. phone call. And this was the first time Noreen had ever heard such an accusation. And up until now, she thought that everything Paul had ever said about Johnny was true and could be proven so, and that he had never received any kind of leniency in his prison time. He wasn't gaining anything from the things he was saying, so she believed that he had no incentive to lie. Noreen later learned that John Gosch Sr. frequently visited a club where Lawrence King and his associates recruited young men. John Gosch Sr. had also brought another woman with him when he first went to meet Paul in prison, and he claimed that this was his wife. Noreen later learned that at least 25 people had been introduced to this woman as John's wife, which is weird. Like, why is he pretending someone else is his wife? But then, is Paul just making that up? You know, because he did eventually meet Noreen and didn't say anything about that. Did he ever confront John Gosch Sr. to say, why did you tell me this was your wife and now I've met her and it's someone else? Like, oh, who knows what is going on? There's another theory going around that Johnny Gosch may actually be someone named Jeff Gannon, but his real name is James Guckett. He was a former male escort and used a fake name, and he somehow became a journalist, I guess, or a reporter of some kind, and obtained White House press passes to question the president. I think people just think this because they think he abused to end up in that kind of work, because they're so traumatized, they don't know what other decision to make, right? They can't function if they don't get any help, so they end up, unfortunately, sometimes becoming escorts or prostitutes. I think that's why people think that this could be Johnny Gosch. But this guy says, look, I'm older than Johnny Gosch would be at this time. I'm happy to do a DNA test because I'm not him. And Noreen thinks that it's possible, but she wants to do a DNA test. I don't know if they ever did do that, but he said that he would. That's one theory. As of 2019, West Des Moines police said that they still receive tips, but none of them have ever helped them solve the case, and after 35 years they still don't know what happened. They never spoke to Paul Bonacci as a witness, so they could never find out if what he was saying had any credibility to it. Noreen has never stopped believing that Johnny was abducted by traffickers. She thinks he's still alive, and that maybe he's got to the point now where he's living his normal life. Maybe he's got a wife and a family, but understands that he can't come home in order to protect himself. So she still holds out hope that Johnny is still alive and is doing better. I don't know what to make of this whole thing, to be honest, because I think it's very possible that a ring of some kind exists in the area and that he was abducted into that. We know those things happen. Very possible. I also think that, unfortunately, Noreen could have been, as I said, kind of duped by people pretending to be Johnny, or her hope made her blind to the fact that this photograph she thinks is Johnny just isn't. It's that hope of him being alive and well that makes her think that it is. I think it's very possible that Johnny, unfortunately, isn't alive. I think with all the true crime cases that I've read or watched or listened to over the years, unfortunately, when a child goes missing, they're not alive for very long. Unless he was involved in some sort of ring, in which case it's very possible that he stayed alive for quite some time. I really don't know what to make of it. I think that the phone calls are odd that they stopped after he went missing, and that the one before he went missing, it seemed as if John Gosch was having some sort of small conversation. But it doesn't prove anything. I think it's either that Paul Bonacci is telling the truth and that there was some kind of ring, or that he was abducted and unfortunately met his end pretty quickly afterwards, as a lot of cases like this end up being like. And that's all I can really say. I'm so confused and my mind is boggled by this whole case, which is why I wanted to cover it. I'd be interested to know what you guys think might have happened here, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry if it was a tough listen. I might have to make my next video